So, in regards to Perkins and Ruiz, childhood sex trafficking really comes in all shape and sizes and can occur anywhere in the world, even in the United States. So, what Perkins and Ruiz did, in contrast to the previous literature review in regards to Florida, they went to a rural western area and ended up interviewing juvenile females and speaking to them about sexual experiences and self trafficking and things of that nature. So what they wanted to do is kind of see what these young women's views were regarding sex and sex manipulation and things like that. So what was really interesting was that many of the females had used sex to manipulate others, but they were doing so in order to survive. So it kind of turns into this idea of self-trafficking. And many of them in this situation felt that they were more empowered rather than being victimized. What Ruiz and Perkins were thinking was that maybe it's due to the fact that they were calling the shots and that it was really necessary for their own way of life. But upon further review, it was realized how self-destructive this was, first of all, and as well as like low self-esteem many of these women had. So many of these women were also really involved in drugs and felt it was the only way in order to receive what they felt that they needed at the time. So they expressed that they were being the manipulators, but they also at the same time kind of expressed the idea that they had to use men in order to get what they wanted. So Farrell and Cronin, we're really talking about the idea of the stigmatism of sex trafficking and all of the traditional beliefs that the typical American society kind of has. And unfortunately, there are a lot of traditional beliefs ingrained in us in regards to sex trafficking, like it doesn't happen in America, that it only happens to young women, it doesn't happen to older women and people that are, only in the drug industry. But these are all really untrue. So they had this Hollywood version, and the other problem was there was a lot of Farrell and Cronin realized there was a lot of stigmas regarding the victims. So instead of being victimized and wanting to assist them to empower them, that a lot of professionals like police officers, even social workers, policymakers tend to end up criminalizing the victim instead of assisting them. Instead of looking at the idea that there's trauma there and that they are, basically only doing it to survive, basically as like Perkins and Ruin had said, that they're being, you know, criminalized and, viewed as prostitutes rather than victims of being modern slaves. So, and then others even unfortunately view them as putting themselves in that position. Like, oh, and it's that same idea of like, oh, well, you put the needle in your arm type of policy. And that's such an unfortunate thought process because we're never going to be able to empower men, women, and children to put that stigma aside if we don't do something from like a micro level in order to change that bias. So the understanding that the entire stigmatism around sex trafficking is work is that like the United States will need to completely revamp their policies and procedures and really the general tone in order to effectively combat this. So finally, Cardenas, she spoke about the newest act that's out, and it came out in 2017. It's called the SAVE Act, which I previously touched on before. It's one of the newest policies of the federal government. It's been put in place to combat online human trafficking, especially the sex trafficking of minors. So instead of just making like the seller, or unfortunately what they call the pimp, liable for this, they're making the purchase of the sexual service of the minors it works towards also criminalization. So you're kind of getting rid of the supply and the demand at once. The problem that come up with this is the glamorization of it and also normalization of it. Before the internet, the idea of like porn was a little bit more taboo, not talked about, sexualization, drugs before the, TV had kind of been out. It was there, but it wasn't so normalized in our society. And the worry is if we talk about it and talk about it and talk about it, that it could create a scenario where it can feel more normalized and it might occur more. I disagree with this in the sense that, until you admit that you have a problem, there's really no way of, working towards a solution. So there's a lot of local advocacy programs, the YWCA, like even in Lancaster County of Harrisburg, they do violence intervention programs, they do a lot of education, the local community, and they even help provide emergency shelters and assisting in childcare for, young women and even children who have children for the victims so that they can begin work and really start to, work on their lives. There's another company called Love 146. It's a nonprofit. It does a lot of advocacy and education and prevention, and it also houses long-term for boys and girls that have been subjected to child sex trafficking, whether it's their parents or them. So the CASE Task Force, Campaign Against Sexual Exploitation of Children, is a national program, but Lancaster County also has a specific task force for it. It's the Lancaster chapter, and it really works with local law enforcement agencies to change policies for child sex trafficking, and it focuses on education of the local community and really trying to work towards teaching children, that it's not okay to be in, abnormal and unhealthy relationships and to be able to speak up and to give them that kind of platform. The North Star Initiative is another one. It's a Lancaster County program. It works with assisting adult women survivors. So this is more towards the aftercare. It works with obtaining housing, with psychological counseling, because unfortunately, the situation is, getting someone out is one portion of it, but then having to deal with the trauma afterwards and all of the destruction that has occurred in their life because of it is a huge portion of it. And it works to provide life skills, assisting the victim to gain employment, and really just housing in general. National one, the SAVE Act of 2015. Obviously, that's the policy that we had talked about in order to combat online victimization, and it really just gives a platform for advocates to begin to start to educate others in America. The Polaris Project, it's a nonprofit organization to help collect data of human trafficking, and they also are the ones who run the human trafficking hotline. So if at any point anyone would call that, they assist them in getting resources, but they categorize, the type of trafficking and really kind of focus on to see, what type of trafficking and really to see this trends and statistics to see kind of what, from a federal perspective, we can do in order to use that information. It also gives ways to reach out without fear of repercussions, and it's semi-government funded, so you can assist in public education and awareness of human trafficking. And I had talked about the Campaign Against Sexual Exploitation of Children in Lancaster County. Well, it's also a national organization. So you work on law enforcement to create a bond that allows for advocacy and preemptive procedures to educate adults and children of the risk factors. And it's also really just creating awareness. It gives victims a platform to speak about their experiences in a positive manner and be able to assist other victims, like victims helping victims, so that they can work towards being able to finally heal. So some of the micro interventions are just being aware. So as a social worker, it's really important to look at the possible risk factors and just to really see that there is a possibility of human trafficking while working with this population that is vulnerable. I mean, we wouldn't be here as a profession without a vulnerable population. We wouldn't need that. So just being aware of that. Also education. So working with other clients, whether they're a risk factor or not, just so that they know that they're educated on an individual level of abuse, neglect, trafficking, unhealthy relationships, just to allow for the seed of positive self-esteem in order to be able to independently help themselves. And also assistance, to give victims assistance of human trafficking, working towards letting them be counseled, working towards helping connect them with resources. So from a meso level, getting involved, obviously, but getting involved with local police stations, connecting them to resources, and also to educate our law enforcement, our social justice system, just the general community. And really working with pre-existing victim advocacy groups would always be helpful in doing this for education, resource connection, and just really being there for clinical therapy and being able to educate others of this general awareness of this crime industry that is occurring. And in addition to getting involved, like education, work with the current facility that you work with or you're affiliated with, and just to help the community from your perspective. As someone who works in the Drug and Alcohol Center, we've actually seen a decent amount of young men and women who have been sex trafficked. So to be able to, whether it's put forth a program or, make sure to touch on it during psychoeducation, just being able to help educate the community that you work in of the risk factors and how they can get help and that you can be there without judgment is really going to help people from, not only a micro intervention, but from a meso perspective. And finally, the macro interventions policy practice. We just created a bill in Pennsylvania not too long ago. It's Bill 11311. It's called Bill 115. It adds the definition of perpetrators. So it really kind of defines the minor to have additional information regarding cases of sex trafficking, because prior to that, there was a lot of problems with trying to get social justice groups and criminal cases to have the information regarding the cases of children and trafficking. So they weren't released prior, so now we're kind of at a point where we're all trying to work together. So, and finally, get involved, being up to date on policy being aware of what's going on in our world, of our community, and connect with a national organization through volunteering or working for them, just to really be there to combat, being on the front lines, showing that, you as a person, you as a social worker, you as a mom, a child, like this is important to you. And that really helps in the overall community as well as the country and around the world. So the conclusion to this is, trafficking is something that's necessary to be addressed and combated. And not just in cities or of high migration. It can happen anywhere. It encompasses modern day form of slavery. So really, unfortunately, whether you look at it one way or another, it's really the definition of force through coercions, threats, bribes, manipulation, really withholding something to receive labor, services, and sex. I mean, it couldn't be a more close definition to modern day slavery. So for anyone who's entangled in this, if they're under 18 and they're sex involved, it's going to be listed as a sex trafficking case. And we need to look at it as that, as them being the victim. And even if they're not a child, to a man or a woman that's even older, to understand that they are victimized. So we do have much more to accomplish on this platform, but the fact that our society is really surely becoming aware of these problems, us as individuals, as social workers, we can actually start to fight for the movement. Because if we don't have that baseline or that foundation, we'll never be able to work towards rectifying this. So, the movement to end childhood sex trafficking and human trafficking in general really begins at the individual level. So for future endeavors, internet-based things, because it's a huge part. So really just trying to work towards being aware of that and understanding that like there will be additional hiccups in that with the addition of technology. Just educate others on a personal level, just being sure to make sure others are aware. Giving additional resources, continuing to assist others in connection, and policy practices. So by researching and becoming involved in local and national efforts, you can be on the front lines and assist in the future generation to dismantle modern slavery. These are my references, and I just wanted to thank you, and I'm sorry it was so long. I was a little long-winded, but thank you.